The brightness of the screen always gets me like that. Okay. Let me just adjust the lighting a bit. I can never get this thing right. One day I'll get this right. One day I'll get the lighting right. Anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson podcast. And today, I'm going to start off with some more anecdotal stories, but then of course we'll kind of move to the larger point as the title, as I've titled this video, about why rewriting history is a bad thing. Now, if you didn't read the description, that's, it's like 2 sentences that I wrote. Today's conversation, I guess, is inspired by the backlash, I guess you could say, of the live Snow White movie that's coming out at some point this year. I didn't actually check because I really don't care. It's one of those things where, like, you can't really just make live action reboot movies just to try and make a cash grab on, like, classic Disney films. It doesn't really work. I mean, Disney's trying to do that with all their movies, and I mean, sure, they have the money to do it, but it's just kind of like one of those talking points about, like, why people hate the rich, and then you look at, like, Disney's behavior, and it's like, yeah. Like, Disney just acts like they have money to burn by making these live action movies, even though they make some money in the box office, but they ultimately, like, tank as movies because you take away a lot of that quote unquote Disney magic from the original classic, what made them classics, and then by changing it as much as they do for basically all the live action movies so far, that magic is gone. And then when you don't have that Disney magic, then it won't last. You can't remake a classic. It doesn't work like that. But anyway, that's just my takes on why I actually wouldn't really be interested in watching the movie. But we're going to talk a little bit about the Snow White movie because of some of the backlash that's come upon it. And this one a lot more, kind of more absurd and abject, as opposed to, like, sure, quite a few of the other live action Disney movies kind of had a little bit of this when people, like, talked about stuff that was wrong with Disney and whatever, and when Disney redid all these old fairy tales and turned it into the Disney classics. But we got, talking about Snow White today, at least for the first little while, before I go into the major talking topic and the problem with this kind of outrage toward the live action Snow White movie that's coming out. Now, for those of you not in the know, I know I'm a little late to talking about this because technically the outrage was, like, last week, but last Monday I was doing a different podcast, and technically I think the article came out last Tuesday or something, so it was basically the day after, and I would not have done enough research to cover it properly anyway if it had, if I had done it the day of or whatever. Not like I did a lot of research, I just read like a few of the basic articles that are going on. But anyway, the backlash, of course, started with Peter Dinklage, the actor, who had this whole outrage about how backward the Snow White movie is, and his whole point was how, it's a Disney is telling, the story that's very like discriminatory against people of diminuators. I think that's the correct term for it. People, dwarfs, or people who are exceptionally short. And Peter Dinklage was talking about like the really crappy depiction that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had on, well, the dwarves. And basically in the trailer they show these guys kind of living like this kind of hovel, similar to like, which is funny because you could say the exact same thing about like Lord of the Rings, where you have a bunch of these like miniature people, I guess you could say, living in like these little hill hovels, just like the hobbits in Lord of the Rings. And basically the dwarves in Snow and the Seven Dwarfs kind of live in one. Well, of course, in the Disney version, they kind of changed it to they live in a cottage. But it really doesn't matter. Basically, you have 7 dudes living together, and of course, if you know the story of Snow White, she stumbles upon this place, and the place is like it's a sty, and Snow White, and everyone makes the joke about how like, yeah, all the anti-feminist jokes about how what's the first thing Snow White does when she walks into a dirty house is start cleaning it. Oof. But anyway, basically the outrage was that, the movie, like, the story is such a backward story and we shouldn't be telling this story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs because of how backward in its thinking that it was. But of course, if you look at some of the comments on social media and whatnot, they kind of make fun of Peter Dinklage, and it's like, do you not know the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Like, it's kind of tantamount to the story that these 7 guys kind of live in this shitty little cottage together, and it's like pretty dirty. And of course, if it wasn't dirty, then technically, if we go with Matt Pat's game or film theory, then technically, Snow White would have died from the poison apple. Shout outs to an old film theory video. Please sponsor me. Game theory, theory channel. I love doing the theory stuff too. But anyway, if for those of you who don't know how his theory goes, that basically it's because of the fact that the house is dirty, and these guys work in a coal mine. The carbon from the coal mines, like, Snow White would have breathed it in as she was cleaning the house, and then that's what actually saved her from the poison from the apple. It's a hilarious theory, and it makes a lot of sense too. So, in contrast, if the house was clean, like Dinklage was suggesting that the house should be for 7 guys to be living in, then I guess Snow White would have died from the apple because there wouldn't have been enough coal mine carbon to be breathing in. And then, of course, there's all the other jokes about how has Dinklage never walked into like a boys' dorm because the cottage that the doors live in would have been very similar to one. What do you get when you have 7 guys just living together and none of them actually put in the effort to clean up their own place? You get a pretty messy place, and it's pretty disgusting. Which I'll tell a funny little anecdote story, because I lived in such a place, kind of, when I was doing my master's degree, and I was living on campus for the first few years, and even though I lived in kind of like a special type of dorm, it wasn't the typical dorms, and this is kind of hard to explain. So you have the typical dorms, which would be for all the lower classmen, first and second years. And if you're in a dorm, then you have to go follow the meal plan and all that stuff because the regular dorms don't have their own kitchen. You know, the whole joke about kids using the heater and then putting like their mac and cheese on top of the heater because they don't have a real kitchen. It's kind of that's how the normal dorms would have been like. But then the dorm I was living in was for older students, and so it was kind of like it had some features of an apartment, like having a kitchen, your own bathroom, and stuff like that. But then, of course, there were some dorm elements, like the living room was a common room and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a weird thing like that. And in my second year of living on campus, because I had lived on campus for 3 years while doing my master's. I actually spent like 5 years doing my master's because writing a thesis and stuff like that. But when I was doing the thesis part, I was living off campus at that point, which was the later part of my degree. But anyway, that's its own crazy story. Anyway, in my second year, I was living with a bunch of guys because, well, of course, because you can't be, at a Christian university, there was no way there's going to be mixed gender dorms like in some schools. So I was living with a bunch of guys. In my first year, it wasn't that bad. The guys were a little bit more mature in how they kept the dormitory and how they kept it clean and whatnot. But in my second year, a lot of the guys, I don't know what it was with this group of guys from my second year, but these guys, they were all really, really bad when it came to keeping the dorm clean. They were all really, really bad. We had a schedule for people to like actually do cleaning and whatnot, throughout the semester. But a lot of the guys, they were really bad on actually keeping with it. A lot of them were never around on cleaning days, like the weekends. So basically how we set it up was that the weekend, you would take like, sure, you want to be doing stuff on the weekend, but at the same time, you should at least spend an hour on a Saturday or a Sunday to just clean the dormitory, like the common room and stuff like that, and mop the floor and whatever. But the guys never really did this. Me being the much older guy, because of course I was doing my master's, all these other guys, they were like third years. So they would have been like, let's say they're 20 years old. And I was 25, 26 at the time, something like that. I think I was 25. I was 25 at the time. So I was 25 and some 5 years older than these guys. But of course, the other thing too, and I always made this joke about it, is like, look, guys, your mom doesn't live here, so you have to do stuff yourself. And you can tell by like the way these guys eat too. Like everything with them is just like instant packed food and whatever. The easy stuff to make that you just like add boiled water kind of thing. None of these guys really knew how to cook or anything like that. So clearly these guys basically had lived as if like, they always lived at home kind of thing. Living the easy life. Unlike yours truly, I had to figure out a lot of that stuff early in life because, growing up in a poor family kind of thing. Just the way it is. But these guys are really, really bad with cleaning the place. And I was the one who often had to do it because I guess because I had to do it a lot growing up because my family, both my parents worked full time and then some. And it was hard, hard to make ends meet and stuff. Being in a poorer family growing up. And so you leave a lot of the cleaning and chores, if you will, to the kids because the parents are always working and always, they work 10 hours a day, both of them. They get pretty tired out and it's hard for them to do house duties and stuff like that. And so my sister, my brother, and I often did a lot of our own cooking and cleaning as we were growing up. And so I was just always used to doing it. And so when I was living in the dormitory, I often had to, I would just get so like bothered by the fact that no one would actually clean up the common space, and so I was the one who often had to do it, and I did it almost like every week because none of the other guys did it. But the point I'm getting at is, until you've lived with just a whole bunch of guys that don't really bother to clean, you don't really know how bad it gets when it's like, oh, a bunch of guys living together. It's not going to be a clean environment. Although, to be fair, the ironic part is it's easy to make fun of a bunch of guys living together, and a guy's dorm would become pretty messy. I've seen girls' dorms. Some of them are kind of worse. And so, it's just what happens when you have a bunch of young people that are preoccupied with, in the case of me living in a dorm, it was school. But going with the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs context, it's like 7 guys who constantly work in a diamond mine, and so they don't have concern for things like hygiene and keeping the house clean. That's not what they care about. What they care about is mining diamonds. That's all that's on their mind. And so it's one of those things where, like, when you think of the whole outrage that Peter Dinklage had about dwarves being as depicted as like these kind of grungy guys, and how it paints diminutive people in a negative light, that they're, the dwarves are all dirty and stuff like that. It's like, well, it wouldn't matter if they were dwarves or ordinary human beings or whatever. It's the fact that there are a bunch of guys that are preoccupied with work. And this is true in many places of the world. Doesn't matter what your job is. It's gonna become like that. Your house is gonna get pretty dirty unless you hire a cleaner and stuff like that, which is, Snow White was basically like a free cleaner. So I mean, that's a sweet deal right there. But it's just kind of comical when you think of, like, oh, there's an outrage about how the dwarves are depicted as these, like, guys who kind of live like slobs. But it's like you've never visited a boys' dorm before. On a side note, did you know that dormitory is an anagram for dirty room? So think about that. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? But anyway, that's enough of the funny story stuff. Now on to the more serious matter. So when you think of a movie like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or let's talk about other Disney remakes that they've done, like the classics, if you will. The live-action Mulan, live-action Beauty and the Beast. And I think that's it so far. Well, can you really call The Lion King a live-action one? It's like mostly CGI. Like, they took, like, real animals and, like, made them do some stuff, but the bulk of it is like CGI. So it doesn't really count. But, I mean, I know some people say, well, the Beast was all CGI and, like, Beauty and the Beast, but I mean, the movie's still live action. But with a lot of these live action Disney movies, just using them as a good example, you run into a big problem with all this major hot take, all the added political kind of nuances to the story. What happens is you end up taking away from any kind of historical context that allowed the story to be what it was when it was originally told. Now, of course, you could get into the case of Disney and how they appropriated a lot of these older fairy tales. For example, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because of course in the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, like, she dies. She straight up dies. And there was no way of saving her. And stuff like that. And of course, you think of The Little Mermaid and how she dies a pretty terrible death. and not the epic ending that Disney gave it with Eric impaling Ursula with a ship. Arguably the best death in Disney, hands down. But you take away a lot from how these older stories were told and accepted in the time that they were written. And you run into a very dangerous kind of territory when you rewrite history so you can tell your modified version of an old story. And this happens all over the place. I'm just using Disney as as a good example because it's kind of in the media. And Disney is an easy example to use, as I will keep referring to these Disney examples. But when you rewrite history to try to fit how you think things should be, you move away from what people in that time period, one, would have accepted in how they told stories, and two, how they dealt with various, what's that word I'm thinking of? Like when you tell a moral in a story, or you're trying to teach something in a story, when you move away from that, you run into some pretty dangerous territory. And so going back with, as I was making a nod to film theory earlier about how the dwarves technically saved her life in the Disney version because they were dirty and were covered in like carbon soot from working in a diamond mine. At least in the Disney version, they save her, right? But anyway, if you change the story to fit your kind of how you think things should be, then the story would not be what it is. It wouldn't be Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and how she meets them and what makes her interaction with them interesting. Because of course, it's not even like this live action movie is the first modern adaptation, if you will, of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I mean, there was that one movie. Remember, I don't know if you guys remember this. Maybe this just shows my age or something. But there was an actress named Amanda Bynes, and she had a bunch of these kind of teen movies during the, I want to say the mid to late like 2000s. And when I say early mid, I obviously mean like from 2005 to 2010 kind of time period. And she had a couple of these kind of movies that they were modernized versions of older stories. So she had She's the Man, I think, which was a modern take on Twelfth Night by Shakespeare. And then of course there was Sydney White, and it was just called Sydney White, I think. And basically it was that Sydney White was well, if you haven't guessed from the title already, it was a readaptation of Snow White. And even though that movie was a quote-unquote modern adaptation, of course, the thing that makes Sydney White work is that it didn't shy away from the darker side of that older story, that the seven guys were kind of pathetic until the female character entered into their lives. And how the Sydney White movie worked really well was because it showed that the feminine power is necessary to awaken seven like social losers, I guess you could say, and awaken them to be real men. And so of course the seven they're not dwarves obviously in the Amanda Bynes movie, but instead of using dwarves, they decided to make them social outcasts, and they were kind of the losers they were losers in the school. And then of course that movie did an interesting take on the seven natures of the seven dwarves. And so you had the guy who had allergies, and so he was sneezy. And then you had the guy who was from another country and never adjusted to the time zone difference, and he was sleepy. Then you had the guy who's kind of really he's really like he's just kind of stupid, and he would obviously be crap. Now Uh, blanking on the names of the dwarves. Not his name's not Doofy. I'm getting his name mixed up with another one, but there was. And basically, what they did was in the Sydney White movie, they stuck with the fact that the guys were social outcasts as a way to make them, different from the ordinary people. And of course, in the Sydney White movie, the context was it was a college, and so you had all the popular people and the college students that were of higher social status, and then you had the seven dweebs, and the seven dweebs were all social outcasts. But of course, Sydney White, she gets ostracized from the higher ups, and then she ends up meeting the seven dweebs, and then she befriends them. And a little part of the story, I wouldn't say it's a big part, but what begins that transition, I guess I should say what begins the transition of her awakening, you know, the masculine energy from the seven dweebs, is that the place they live in, and it's funny in the movie they call it the vortex, and then the joke is, why is it called the vortex? Their house, and then it's like it sucks in all the losers. It sucks in all the losers. But anyway, in the vortex where they live, like the place is in disrepair, and so Sydney, who's also happens to know a lot about interior design and working with she knows a lot about interior design because her dad is a plumber, and so she kind of takes after him, and so she kind of helps get the place all fixed up for them. And so, but of course the other guys are kind of amazed that she's able to do this for them, and they're really they grow a huge attachment to her. And of course she awakens in them how to be better people, so Grumpy isn't so grumpy all the time, just like how it is in the Disney version, that he's not so angry all the time. And the guy from he's from an African country and he's never adjusted the time zone. Sydney helps him adjust the time zone and get him used to waking up like everyone else, and makes him kind of normal. And she awakens in them how to be like people, as opposed to just kind of stuck being the dweebs that they are. And so the idea is that Snow White, going back to the original story, she awakens within the seven dwarves what it means to be human. And of course, in the original story, of course, there's obviously a racial aspect to it, that the dwarves are, well, not ordinary humans. They're not humans in the sense of, they're dwarves and then they're humans. I mean, if you were playing Warcraft, humans and dwarves are treated like two different races. So, in the sense, Snow White awakens in the dwarves what it means to be human and awakens their humanity. And that's why in the original story, that's why the guys are such slobs, and they're overly preoccupied with just looking for diamonds, even though everyone makes a joke of like, who do these guys even work for? Why are they so busy with getting diamonds when you don't know anything about like who's the person that they supply, who's their buyer. You never learn that in the story. So anyway, basically what I'm getting is that the dwarves have no real identity in the story, but Snow White awakens that within them, and she draws out their humanity by showing them compassion, kindness, and stuff like that. And of course, the Disney version really added an extra notch to that by having the dwarves actually react to her death, and that they try and kill the evil stepmother. The dwarves try and kill her in the Disney version. They never say it that way, but they try to kill her, and then of course, because of convenience, a lightning bolt does the job for them. But basically, they were out to kill her because they've awakened humanity within the dwarves, which is kind of interesting that Disney does it that way. And I think it's one of the brilliance of the Disney version, the original classic, and why it's a classic. And Snow White awakened that in them, that they they have such a strong reaction. But at the same time, even though their reaction's a bit extreme, kind of shows that they're still in that growth process. Like they don't know how to enact justice properly. But at the same time, how could they in such a short amount of time that they've had with Snow White? They wouldn't know how to properly enact justice. But at the same time, what would their lives have been like without her? Would they have been able to feel such emotion? And I think that's a very powerful story in the original Snow White. So going back with the whole outrage about like, oh, you know, it's kind of politically incorrect to portray the dwarves in the movie, the live action version, the way that they are. It's like you're taking away from, it's like you're taking away from the whole story of Snow White, because once again, Snow White is a story people should generally know, even if you've never seen the Disney version or read the Grimm's fairy tale. Even if you haven't actually watched or read the whole story, people have a good idea of how the story goes down. But you think of these, like when Peter Dinklage has this whole outrage about like all the dwarves being depicted this way. It's like you're missing the point of the entirety of the story. Because a big part of the story is that Snow White, in the short amount of time that she has with them, she changes them quite a bit. And so you're if you were really to say like a pro-feminist movie and talk about how great, you know, that it is that these men have a woman in their life, and that, you know, woman power, and I'm all for woman power. You should be praising that in the story, in Snow White's character. That's why, you know, despite the fact that in comparison to other princesses, she doesn't really do that much, but in what she does in affecting the dwarves' lives, she shows she's a very powerful influence in their lives. And that's something that's very praiseworthy. And that was something that the original story, as well as the Disney version, really captured well in their in, you know, the original and the Disney version of Snow White. It really captured that, and it really brought praise to the feminine power of Snow White. And of course, by extension, that's the real reason why Snow White is the fairest of them all, as opposed to the contrast would be, well, the evil stepmother is so vain in her looks. But then Snow White is still deemed the fairest of them all. And sure, you know, she's supposed to be a pretty face, but of course, what really makes her the fairest of them all is that she has, through her compassion and her kindness and her good nature, Snow White is able to change 7 guys who normally wouldn't give a shit about anything about life in general. That's kind of the powerful impact of her character, and that's kind of the moral of the story, is that you have to allow people to bring change into your life. But this outrage about changing, oh, Snow White shouldn't be so dainty, and oh, the dwarf shouldn't be such slobs or whatever, you take away from that dynamic. And so when you take away from that dynamic, then the story is lost. And when you, more importantly than the story being lost, the history behind why those lessons were needed are taken away. I just had this funny idea, this funny little thought. In contrast, and you know, I was watching these videos too, and this is kind of a common thing on YouTube that's been around. So I'll talk about it too. I'll just give my little 2 cents about it. But there's been a lot of commentary about why like Japanese manga does so well versus American comics, and there's lots of reasons behind that. There's so many different factors, and all these different guys on YouTube have their takes on those different factors. And I could say a bunch of things, and it's not like I have anything new to contribute. in that regard. But I think something interesting that just came to mind, you know, you talk about like the story of Snow White, and when modern movie elites, Hollywood elites is not the accurate way of putting it, but basically Hollywood elites try to rewrite history to fit, you know, their political agenda, and rewrite, or they're rewriting, I should word that better. They're rewriting history by changing and rewriting old films as they try to modernize them. You take away something, primordial lessons that human beings need to learn about themselves, about life, and about growing as a human being. Of course, there's a one of the factors that some of these guys on YouTube and talk about why manga does better than American comics, etc., is that someone worded it this way: manga touches you while comics preach to you. Of course, that's not the best way of putting it. Or rather, or that's not accurate. It's more accurate to say you can't word it. The problem of wording it like that is you're skipping the steps of what exactly is wrong with projecting ideas onto people. And so once again, going back with trying to change Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you're projecting how people should view the story of Snow White, as opposed to letting the story of Snow White interact with you as a person. You're projecting what people should think the story is, as opposed to how it makes you, how the story actually makes you feel, and how the story can be used to have you grow. Because of course, you know, the reason why I don't like the statement of like, well, things preach to you is like, well, technically I do that all the time. As a pastor, you know, preaching is kind of what I do. But of course, the way that I would just, you know, when people say, well, how is a Christian preacher different from, say, like, oh, Western comics preach to you? It's kind of the distinction I'm trying to make. And this is the way I would word it, and this is how it kind of works in my mind. When I try to preach Jesus to people, ultimately, my approach is, I want you to be better. Now, you don't have to agree with my solution. It's a free country. But in the Christian worldview, by having Jesus forgive you of your sin, you are then free to be a better person. You're not bound by guilt of any wrongdoing you've done. You're not bound by those things. And then you can be empowered to be a better person, help people, you know, make your own life better or whatever. And so the Christian worldview is, well, Jesus forgives us of our sins, and that empowers us to do that. As opposed to, if we are in bondage with sin, then that holds us back from being better people. But with that being said, when I preach, if you will, the idea I'm getting at is, I want you to be a better person. The problem when you think of like comic books and the way they preach, what a lot of those critics actually mean is that a lot of writers use the platform of, say, Marvel Comics. They use the platform for you, not to make you feel better, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it's instead to you must validate their ideas, as opposed to how you should be growing as a person. Okay, now that I've explained that bit, the contrast I'm going to use with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is actually an anime I've got into. And I know some of you might be like, oh, a pastor watching that kind of stuff. I mean, like, any anime is already like red flag territory if you think about it hard enough. But an anime I've gotten into is My Dress Up Darling. And it's basically it's an anime about, you have, and this is something that, well, anyway, I'll tell the story, I'll tell the premise of it first, and then I'll talk about a common trend in anime. But basically, in My Dress Up Darling, it's about this, there's this guy, and he loves Hina dolls, and he wants to be a Hina doll maker. but he's kind of ashamed of his passion for Hina dolls because when he was a kid, someone called him like disc. It's kind of gross that boys are into that. Was basically what he remembers, that someone said that to him, and so he's kind of ashamed of it, and he's kind of very to himself because of it. And he's the isolated kind of loner character because of it. You know, the socially awkward guy with no friends. And then of course he meets a girl, and she she's very outgoing. She's very she's popular. She's good looking, and all that. But what you, the audience, quickly learn, and as well as the main character, what you quickly learn is that she's actually a huge otaku, and she wants to be a cosplayer. But the problem is she sucks at making clothes, and so when the girl, Kitagawa is her name, she learns that Gojo, the guy, she learns that he can make clothes. They kind of make this deal that she'll pay him to make her clothes so she can live her dream of being a cosplayer. Love story ensues. So basically, and this is a common trope in Japanese animation, where you tend to have these opposites attract, and as the opposites meet, sure their worlds clash, but as their worlds clash, they awaken they awaken things within each other. Like, for instance, with using, I'll stick with My Dress Up Darling for a minute, then we'll go back to Snow White. Yeah, that's a great podcast right there. That's the weirdest comparison you've ever heard, right? But anyway, in My Dress Up Darling, Gojo is awakened what it means to be dependable, to be someone that he's a provider, and he is someone that can he can he can build upon a vision, and he is someone who is constructive in life. Of course, this is the opposite of how he starts in the beginning of the story, where he's ashamed of himself. But instead, as he throughout the story, he's able to make cosplay costumes, and he's actually pretty good at it because he's good at making clothes. He becomes confident in himself, and he develops strength, and that inner strength, I should say. And you know, when you take a story like that, and any guy that reads it, sure, there's all the fan service and stuff like that, but any guy that reads a story, they would be like, yeah, you know, you look at Gojo, and every guy would think like, yeah, you know, I want to be like that. I want to grow like that. I want to be someone that is dependable, and someone that, you know, people can rely on, and be strong for others. That's what every guy dreams to be. And so in an anime story with something like something is the funny modern context is like a guy who makes clothes and a cosplayer. And of course within Kitagawa, this awakens, you know, the masculine. Okay, so first, going back with Gojo, the feminine awakens the masculine. So Kitagawa awakens within Gojo his strength to be reliable, to be someone that can be trusted, and someone that can provide for someone else, and he takes care of her and her endeavors to be a cosplayer. And then of course Gojo's masculinity, as he grows, awakens Kitagawa, and how it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be it's okay to be it's okay to be, you know, not just vulnerable, but open about it. And she can express herself a lot better, and come to terms with actually caring about people. Because of course, and this is typical in anime, and you know, My Dress Up Darling is, and the funny thing about anime is that it does this a lot. It's like there's so many, like you could watch like hundreds of anime, and lots of them just follow this kind of premise, where you have the male and the female who are opposites kind of meet, and then their worlds clash, but then they awaken these kind of the same kind of qualities. Really, the guy becomes someone reliable, because the guy starts out as, you know, the outcast, socially awkward, and, you know, to be fair, you know, the Japanese writers understand the male fantasy that way, where every guy starts out awkward but wants to be, you know, the mega Chad, right? As opposed to the kind of quiet nobody that he was before. And of course, the female learns that she can depend on a man, but more importantly, she can allow herself to express her feelings and not feel like she's manipulative about it, but rather her feelings are genuine. And so in anime, that's kind of the back and forth, and it's so many. I could name you hundreds of anime that do this, because in Japanese manga writing, and this is another big thing that's the difference between Western comics and manga, and why manga is so successful, is that sure, manga tells the same story over and over, but that same story is the story of the human experience, and that's why, you know, there was the whole joke that you could make a manga about dudes fishing. That's it, just fishing. But you tell a story about the human condition and what is true about all of us as people. And you can make it about anything, because once again, it relates to all different people. And so in that vein, you know, going back with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, I mean, that's the story that's being told, is that the opposites attract, the worlds clash, but then they grow with each other's company. And it's just a reminder of how important it is for community, as well as, you know, love and affection, and actually having someone care about you, and how that changes you. But if you don't allow that space for growth, then real growth never happens. And then what do you have when people don't grow? Well, you get adult children. You get people that don't know how to care for other people, and then you get people who ultimately act extremely selfishly, and in a way kind of like brats, adult brats. And of course, it's so easy to shit on those people that like behave that way. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we see in the world now. You have, especially like, and I remember watching a guy's video about it, where unfortunately, due to stuff like social media, and one of the major negative effects from it is that we've kind of bred this generation of like sociopathic people. You know, people that just have ridiculous outbreaks and cry over, like, kind of, in the grand scheme of things, really dumb shit. And people just cry over it, like, on camera, and then they like post it on social media to get like sympathy points from strangers behind a screen. I mean, there are tons of modern examples now, but I remember when I was younger, I'll use a one from my past, and I know I'm going to walk into hot territory here, because I will be pointing out a person that I'm sure I'm going to try and keep it as ambiguous as possible, but once I mention it, you guys will know exactly what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about. Not like that person's going to come to this small ass channel and bully the shit out of me for it, but anyway. This was, I want to say, you know what, I'm just going to look up the date. But you'll know where I'm going with this once I kind of get the date. Because I'm going to talk about a very specific event that happened. And I wouldn't say in relative recent time. Because this happened 10 years ago. Now that I just looked at it, I'm like, holy crap, that was 10 years ago? So the person in question, or rather, not the borderline sociopathic moment, but the 10 years ago, wow, it's so weird to think it's actually more than that now. Steve Jobs. You guys remember him? When Steve Jobs passed away, back in 2011. That's what I was actually looking up. When Steve Jobs died in 2011, people actually posted on YouTube of them crying over his death. And sure, we all think like, oh, he was pretty great because, he was the big pioneer to like Apple's recent success at the time. And I mean, Apple's still extremely successful because of his legacy. But I remember back in 2011 when people actually posted videos and they were crying over the fact that he died. And then of course the whole joke was like, what was like, look, Steve Jobs wasn't Jesus, okay? Like, you don't like, it's insane that we're just crying over his death on like all over social media. And sure, because of how Steve Jobs evolved the technological era in that time period, especially with pioneering Apple to become what's the word I'm thinking of? The kind of standard of how technology would progress, and the springboard of how technology would progress, especially through Apple. And sure, Steve Jobs did all that, but you think about it now, it's like it was, and even back then, after like the initial like shock, I guess, of Steve Jobs was dead, you look back, it's like, wow, it's so ridiculous that people cried all over, like made videos of themselves crying because he died. And it's like, sure, he salvaged Apple and made it famous, but minus that, like, who was he to you, right? And that was one of the things that's just kind of, I mean, back then with Steve Jobs, and people talk about like how great he was, that at least had a little bit more tact to it compared to like stuff nowadays. You see people like on social media cry over really dumb stuff, and they'll say like, oh, my pet died, I'm gonna film myself cry about it, or something idiotically crazy like that. Not like I'm downplaying that it's not sad that your pet died. I mean, it's gonna be a sad day when my cat dies, but I'm not gonna film myself crying holding a dead cat's body and then post it on the internet. That's insane. That's batshit crazy is what that is. But we've kind of bred, like, social media has kind of bred a generation that does that, and it's really massive when you think about it. But basically, where does that come from? Well, it comes from people not really allowing themselves to grow as people, and they allow themselves to have kind of really stupid emotional breakdowns over things you shouldn't have emotional breakdowns over. But of course, you run into this weird paradox of we all have to be emotional. But you look at old stories like Snow White and whatever Disney movies, the movies that Disney uses, Beauty and the Beast and these old stories. And you look at how did people grow and change. And the old stories taught us that like we need to get out of old ways of thinking and mature a bit and allow, in the case, most often these stories use like, okay, the male meets the female is the typical formula. But of course the reason for that is because when you're introduced to that energy, the masculine meets the feminine and vice versa, then you learn how to properly channel your emotions to people that actually matter in your life, as opposed to like crying over dumb shit, like, and making a big fuss about it online kind of thing. Not to say that once again, the pet example is not the best one, where like, okay, it is a big deal when your pet dies, but it is kind of a problem when you cry over it and film yourself doing it. That's kind of crazy. But if you don't allow yourself that space to grow, well, then that it develops those kind of people. That's the TLDR. If you don't allow yourself to grow, and so when you rewrite history, so that the dwarves, we shouldn't make them slobs, and we shouldn't make Snow White so girly. You take away from that. You take away from that very essential part of human development. The masculine meets the feminine. In this case of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and in the case of a lot of stories, as I've mentioned, like in My Dress Up Darling, an anime that I've gotten into as of late. And I know many people are like, what, pastor into that stuff? Even though, like, I know, like, not the best example with My Dress Up Darling, because, I mean, that one is way, like, that's a pretty perverted anime compared to other animes. Like, it's pretty in your face about it, about the fan service. But the story itself, underneath that, the masculine meets the boy meets girl, masculine energy, feminine energy, and growth in that encounter. It's a tale as old as time, and it is something that we all need in order to foster us as better human beings. And so, in Snow White, by rewriting that history, you take away from that. And when you take away from that, then you take away one of the fundamental parts of human development. And that is a scary place if you want to rob people of stories and their ability to tell that story. That we need to that how we grow in that encounter. And that's a scary place to be, because we're already seeing some of that now, where you have a lot of entitled women that act like they have no regard for anyone else, because they've never had that masculine energy in their life to have them foster their the idea. And I know this is like a mega hot take, but the idea that women are inherently compassionate. I know, crazy, right? Women are inherently compassionate, but that really comes out when they have to be compassionate to a man, because the man is not default to be compassionate. And so when the feminine meets the masculine, and the woman has to really project compassion in a place where there normally isn't compassion. The contrast would be if women were only around other women, it's just everybody's got compassion. So compassion itself diminishes in its value. It's kind of this idea, when I was doing my Bible reading stream, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and I was reading over, I think it was Luke 6 or whatever it is. Oh, sorry. Obligatory water noise. Give me a minute. Okay, I think it's good enough. Sorry about that. Obligatory pipe noises. Anytime I do these kind of talking streams, whether it's the podcast or the Bible reading stream, you're always going to get it at least once. It's just kind of how it is. I mean, this room is beneath a washroom. And so if that washroom gets used, then the pipes have to, move that water around, and resulting in that noise. But anyway, where was I? See, now I lost my train of thought. Right. So when I was talking about in the Bible stream 2 weeks ago, and I think it was Luke 6, might be Luke 5. I can't remember. It was a couple weeks ago. And it was the love your enemies passage. And Jesus talks about how, what's the point of being nice to people, like being good to people of your own kind, in the sense of like people who are nice to you. Like you're being nice because someone else is nice to you. Sinners can do that, right? Like basically when Jesus says, he's basically saying that's not remarkable. But when Jesus says love your enemies, well, the idea is because your enemies normally wouldn't love you. And so now I don't want to make this whole war on man versus woman thing by implying that, well, all women, when you have to channel that same kind of principle when it comes to how women approach men and men approach women. But the idea that, well, women are compassionate by nature, but guys are not, right? Because just like in the stereotype in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, well, if you have a bunch of guys that are just only around other guys, they're just going to be fixated on work and then a bunch of slobs at home and not give a damn, right? That's what guys do. And so when Snow White shows compassion, it is a jarring thing for them because, once again, for Snow White, that may be the default. But for the dwarves, it is not to be compassionate. But at the same time, that compassion is what allows them to grow. In the same time, well, once again, it's not so much, you don't see so much of the woman's, or you don't see much influence from the guys to her, right? The dwarves don't allow Snow White to grow as much because, of course, as older stories, a lot of these stories were actually intended to teach men how to be better in society as a whole. Surprise, surprise. And that's the other thing, too, that is a big danger of rewriting history like that in regards of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as our example. A lot of these stories, even though they have like princesses and stuff like that, the stories are really about the men, the male characters, and the stories were geared towards men. So that's the other thing too that a lot of people actually don't understand and get about these stories is that, like for example, well, going back to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the story is actually intended for men, and the point of the story is that it's basically another example, if you will. It's not like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is the only example of this, but it's basically a story of where female compassion can make men do great things and be better. That is the point of the Snow White story. And so if you diminish, changing the dwarves, that they're not these, slobby, kind of primitive roughrousers, then you take away from that. Then how are you going to teach men to be better? Of course, one of the backward ideas, mega hot take, one of the backward ideas that a lot of feminists are proposing is that, well, it's backwards because they're really hypocritical about it. On the one hand, they're like, we want men to be better. Understandable. Men should be better. But then they suggest that, men should be learning things about compassion and being, better to women, whatever. Once again, true. And then the hypocritical part that makes no sense comes along and says, well, men should be able to figure that out. No, that's not how history ever was. Men never figure stuff out. I mean, isn't that the premise of every single rom-com? Is that the guy is denser than a diamond block? Like, unless you spell it out for the guy, he ain't gonna figure stuff out. That's the premise of every rom-com. And why rom-coms are so true in that sense. And it's one of those funny things where, like, as an adult, I'm actually into a lot of Japanese rom-coms because they're actually good. But I'm into more rom-coms because, once again, it tells that story about how to be a better man very well. And of course, it's one of those funny things that I've applied to like my own love life. And not to be a dense mother effer, right? And it's so true that, you know, the guy really needs like the woman to spell it out for him. And so, of course, that's the other thing that, you know, the flip side of the story in a lot of these rom-coms is that the masculine energy and his stupidity reminds her that she has to spell it out. Like a woman has to be very clear in what she communicates and to be much more upfront with her feelings, because the guy's never gonna figure it out. But that's the paradox that a lot of modern feminists are demanding from men is like, well, you figure it out. It's like, we're not. If humans have been around for tens of thousands of years, and men still haven't figured it out. So what makes you think they're gonna figure it out now? I mean, there's a whole joke about why the Bible is the way it is. Like God has to spell it out for people because clearly men ain't gonna figure it out themselves. So the quote unquote special revelation when we read in the Bible is that, yeah, God has to spell it out because men ain't gonna figure it out. And you know, we can laugh at stuff like that, but at the same time, that was the point of these old stories, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is to remind us how much we need each other. Well, in the older stories, the context was why men needed women, and that women would awaken things like kindness and compassion in men, and how important that was to make a better world. That's why those stories exist. You cannot erase that. And that's one of the dangers of like, oh, let's rewrite Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's an old story. It doesn't get with the times. It's not progressive enough. You take away from that important lesson that men need and still need, because every man will need that lesson. But you cannot change the narrative of old stories, and even new stories for that matter. You cannot change the narrative of old stories, because you'll take that away. You'll take that teaching away from men. Maybe in the future I'll do a follow-up video to this and talk about this is the same in women as well, for in different ways, obviously. But it's the case in point of why men need women and women need men, and it doesn't have to be solely romantic. I'm not just, you know, doesn't have to just be in that, but like why men need women and women need men, why human beings need each other for these important developmental states of the human psyche. But you risk losing all of that when you rewrite history to make it more politically correct, because you don't want to make people look like they were backwards in their thinking once. But here's another way of looking at it. And this is one of those other paradoxes that people like to, they like preaching this, but then at the same time people yell like foul when they see this in play. But on the one hand, it's like, in the past, you were a stupid person. I was a stupid person. We were all stupid people once upon a time. After all, you don't become enlightened. You don't become, you have to become enlightened. But the implication of that is there was a time when you were not enlightened. Think of it like that. And every human being goes through this process. There was a time where you were probably a really stupid person. And, you know, so was I. We were all stupid people at one point. But we all learned from mistakes. We all learned from, you know, people wiser than us teaching us things. We learned from these old stories that are founts of wisdom from generations past. And we take those lessons, apply them into our life, and move forward to make our lives better in the future. This goes back to when I was talking about, like, well, the difference that in my mind of like when I preach like Jesus to people versus like when Marvel Comics preaches diversity for the sake of it. The idea of like, I'm not here to validate, I'm not here to make you validate my ideas. I'm here to help you grow. So I'm going to try and teach you things with my ideas, and how you go about it. Hopefully you'll take some parts of it and take what you need, and you will go forward. That's the idea. And that's good preaching, right? It's that I give you an example and then you move forward. But the ultimate goal is that you will be a better person. And so rewriting history is a dangerous thing because you take that away from people. You take away the thought that we started not in the best place, but I'm going to move forward with new perspective and be better. Because that's ultimately what all of us want as we go through, each day. And, it's funny where today's the 31st of January. So the whole joke of trial month of 2022 is over because it's starting February tomorrow. So you're knee deep in now. But now that trial period's over and you got to really engage 2022, well, how are you going to go about it, right? How are you going to move forward? And you cannot erase the history of what was. But instead, you should use history to spring yourself forward. I was going to go another route when talking about the dangers of erasing history, because there's so many dangers to it, and maybe we'll come back to that in the future as well. But it is like 5:15, so we're kind of gonna end the major spiel, and I'll kind of jokey thing at the end, just to end the stream in a bit. But my closing statement is that you can't take away the past and the way people told stories, because there's a lot of crappy stuff in it. Going back with like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the story itself is a pretty dark story. It always was. But at the same time, the point of the story is to teach people how to go forward and how to be better people. And this is actually, in my mind, the secret of why Disney was so successful when it redid all these stories and it retold them. Not just Snow White, but The Little Mermaid and Sleeping Beauty and all these stories. And aside moving from some of the more grotesque things in the Grimm's version, but I'll just use the Snow White example because we started with Snow White, so we're going to end with Snow White in this stream. In the original version of the Grimm's fairy tale, original version of the story, Snow White dies, and then the guys kind of put her in the glass coffin, and then nothing really comes out of it. Nothing really happens. You just leave her, and the story's more open-ended in the Grimm's fairy tale. There's no real ending to it because the guys are basically confused. They have no idea what to do now, and they kind of fall into this like eternal depression because the only person that's ever shown them compassion is gone, and then they don't know what to do with their lives, and they realize how hollow their lives are. The constant routine of just going to the diamond mine and nothing ever comes out of it. And so they end up like committing suicide, and they all like commit suicide next to her box, and then basically like it's Snow White in the glass box, and then a bunch of dead dwarves around it because they all committed suicide just outside of it. The whole Kool-Aid style. Oh god, I can't believe I brought that joke, but basically that's what happens. Really dark ending. They do like the whole Kool-Aid thing, and they just die next to her because they don't know what to do. Disney decided we ain't doing that ending because we want to move forward. We want to make Disney. We gotta have a happier ending because we want to appeal to kids, and two, we don't want to be stuck in the depression that the dwarves fell into, but we wanted to allow Snow White to inspire us. And so Disney created the scenario where the dwarves go for blood, and they go for revenge, and they hunt down the evil queen, and the lightning bolt conveniently kills them for, conveniently kills her for them, so they don't have to get their own hands dirty. So super convenient, even though like all 7 of the dwarves are ready to get their pound of flesh from that bitch. But basically, that's how it went down in the Disney version, because when Disney was remaking the story, they wanted to really show that the dwarves had changed so much more, and that they allowed themselves to express their emotions, the raw emotions even, and that was all thanks to Snow White. And so, in a way, the Grimm's fairy tale itself and how it inspired Disney to retell the story, you cannot forget the dark past, but at the same time, you can't allow yourself to be stuck in it. And so Disney did not allow themselves to kind of tell the suicidal ending in the Grimm's fairy tale version, but rather they made a new ending on how, with modern values, how to go about the death of Snow White. And so that the revenge tale kind of takes place, even though like in the Disney movie it's like what, 10 minutes, if even that long. I think it's like 8 minutes is the whole revenge sequence. Like that's it. You think like, oh, you just like they made a whole extra plot in the Disney version, and the movie is only like 8 minutes. But I mean, that was skillful movie making back then, that you could actually tell that in 8 minutes. But anyway, it's really it's all about moving forward, and you cannot move forward if you change the past. I mean, I could make this whole, that's fundamentally the flaw of every time travel movie, where a person says, well, if I could go back in time, I'd change this. But then it's like, well, how would you go forward then? How would you develop as a person if you think just going back in time? If you just want to go back in time to fix your mistakes, as opposed to learning from your mistakes and going forward and being the person you could be, and the potential of being someone great. Anyway, so this is going to be the end of the stream, because I've kind of said everything I wanted to. Well, mostly everything I wanted to, but there's a lot of others, like there's so many other reasons why erasing the past is dangerous. And there's real historical applications. We could go into like all kinds of historical theorizing, but I think we'll save that for another day. I just stuck with the Snow White thing today and off-tracked that with anime, so that was already enough content for today, but I think this is a good place to stop. Just a bit of housekeeping for this week. Wednesday, Shining Light and I are back for, I think, should be the end of Rise Eterna. Like, I'm pretty far, I must be pretty far in the game. So, I think we must be drawing close to the end of the game. At least I feel like that in my mind. If not one, but at most 2 more parts to that. But we'll be doing part 5 on Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. Earlier stream, but in order to get enough gaming hours in, we stream earlier on Wednesdays. So that's Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time for Rise Eterna. Should be coming close to the end of that one. Thursday is the typical Throwback Thursday Heroes of Might Magic video. We are coming pretty close to the end of it, but I think it'll be fine to not do like a Throwback Thursday, like at least not an upload series. I might do some live videos, like stream styles or something. We'll see. But we'll see what I end up doing for after I finish Heroes 2, because I'm coming pretty close to it. But this week we'll have that Throwback Thursday upload, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And then Friday, last Friday I was making that whole joke about like, man, I'm just getting worse and worse at keeping like a deadline on what Bible passages I will read, because I mean, Last week we only got 1 chapter done. Well, I'm gonna try and get back to 2 chapters. I'll try and do chapters 9 and 10 this Friday, but anything can happen where I can get sidetracked like I did on last Friday. Although we had a good theophany talk, so which I mean that thing could have been its own stream. I mean, maybe I'll do the theophany thing for like a podcast in the future. But anyway, sidetracking. But for this coming Friday, we'll try and do chapters 9 and 10 for the book of Luke. And that will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So I can give myself more time. Because 2.5 hours, I realize isn't even that much time when you're doing like a full-on Bible study like that. Because, I mean, to be fair, the book of Luke is just so rich in content. There's just so much into it that we could keep reading and talking about. So, but this Friday, we'll try and do Luke 9 and 10 at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So that's it. That's all the announcements for this week. Actually, I should point out something now. For obvious reasons, on the 14th of February, I will not be doing a podcast. I could try and maybe do a pre-recorded one. I'll see if I have time to fit one in and make a pre-recorded one. If not, but well, if I do a pre-recorded one, then I'll just like upload it at this usual stream time. So that would be like 4 o'clock Pacific time or whatever. And just set like a premiere or something. If I do a video. But either way, I will not be doing a stream on that day. And that would be February the 14th, which is a Monday. So I might as well say that now. Because I don't want to spring it onto you like next week. But little dating tip for you guys. For you guys watching this. So I already know I'm not going to be here on the 14th because I've actually made reservations already to where I'm, to where we're going. I already made reservations. And I made it way beforehand. And not only that, I told her, my girlfriend, I told her that we're going out to a specific place. I've told her more than 2 weeks in advance. And so I guess in all fairness, I will tell you in 2 weeks in advance that I will not be here on February 14th for obvious reasons. So with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. I will see you guys on Wednesday for Rise Eterna at 2 o'clock. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and God bless you.